Imagine it's the autumn of 1944. The Apennine Mountains in Italy are covered in a dense fog and freezing mud. The most powerful army in the world, the United States Armed Forces, is fighting a bloody battle against Nazi defensive lines. But within this American army, there is an open wound, a living contradiction. The United States is crossing the ocean to liberate Europe from Adolf Hitler's racist tyranny, while maintaining, within its own ranks, an unrelenting racial segregation. Black American soldiers lay down their lives for their country, but they cannot eat at the same tables as white soldiers. They cannot use the same restrooms. They do not fight in the same infantry units. For the generals in Washington, mixing races on the front lines would cause the collapse of military discipline. They believe this to be a universal truth, until the transport ships dock in Naples. From these ships, 25,000 men step off wearing uniforms of a slightly different olive drab. They don't speak English. They carry a peculiar symbol on their shoulders, a snake smoking a pipe. They are the FEB, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, the only nation in Latin America to send ground troops to fight fascism in Europe. American officers look at the lines of Brazilian soldiers and are struck with shock. There, marching shoulder to shoulder, sharing the same accent, are white, dark-skinned black, indigenous, and mixed-race soldiers. There are no divisions. There are no separate battalions based on color. The black soldier carries the ammunition for the white soldier. The mixed-race sergeant gives orders to the blonde soldier of German descent. To the segregated command of the United States, that was not just a foreign army. It was a glimpse of a future they feared, and one that would change the dynamics of that war in a way that history books rarely tell. To understand the scale of the short circuit that Brazil caused in the minds of American generals, we need to step inside the so-called Red Cross clubs and R&R canteens in Italy. Cities like Pisa and Pistoia became the backdrop for a silent cultural war. The American military police, the famous MP, operated under strict orders: keep black soldiers away from establishments reserved for white military personnel. But the Brazilians knew nothing of these segregation laws. They didn't understand why a man's skin color determined where he could drink a beer after nearly dying in a trench. On a cold night, a group of Pracinhas, as the Brazilian soldiers were called, walks up to an American recreational center. Among them are black soldiers. At the door, an American MP sergeant extends his arm and says that the whites can come in, but their black friend has to stay out. The Brazilians look at each other. The concept of leaving a brother in arms behind because of the color of his skin sounded absurd, almost offensive. Accounts from veterans show that the reaction was immediate. The white Brazilian soldiers crossed their arms and said, in a broken Italian mixed with Portuguese, "If he doesn't go in, nobody goes in." Arguments like this escalated rapidly. In several episodes, the Brazilians refused to back down, threatening to draw their own weapons against the American military police to defend their black comrades. For the Brazilians, their country and their uniform came before any skin color. And this attitude triggered a domino effect. Black American soldiers, who operated supply trucks and artillery in the region, began to notice. They saw white Brazilian officers sitting at cafe tables, sharing the same cigarette with black soldiers, laughing as equals. For the African American soldier, humiliated daily by his own uniform, the Brazilian camps became a sanctuary of dignity. They began to frequent Brazilian areas simply because there, for the first time in their military lives, they were treated like human beings and like real soldiers. American generals watched this with their hair standing on end. They sent confidential reports expressing concern that socializing with the Brazilians was corrupting the mindset of black American soldiers, who now saw that segregation was not a rule of the world, but a choice made by the United States. But the coexistence between Americans and Brazilians wasn't just made of ideological tensions. There was also the brutal day-to-day reality of the war in the mountains. The Americans had the best logistics in the world: endless canned food, state-of-the-art equipment, thermal jackets. The Brazilians arrived with thin cotton uniforms, completely inadequate for the European winter, and had to be re-equipped by the Allies. This gap in abundance spawned stories that became folklore in the camps of Italy. One of them tells the story of the supply war. In the freezing trenches of the Gothic Line, the Brazilians began to notice that their rations and blankets were mysteriously vanishing during the night, borrowed by neighboring American units. The Brazilian commander went to the American officer to complain. The American, with a sarcastic smirk, shrugged and said that this was war, and they should learn to take care of what was theirs. The Brazilians took that advice very seriously. The following night, a group of Pracinhas used their deep woods infiltration skills. They silently slipped into the American supply depot. The next day, the Brazilian camp had not only recovered what they had lost, but was displaying piles of brand new thermal jackets, boxes of chocolates, luxury rations, and American cigarettes. When the furious American officer returned to complain, the Brazilian commander simply smiled and repeated his own words back to him. "Well, Captain, this is war. Learn to take care of what is yours." And then, there is the legend of the Sherman tank. Military lore from veterans says that after a bar fight where American soldiers were arrogant toward the Brazilians, the Pracinhas decided to get even in the ultimate style of Brazilian resourcefulness and cunning. In the dead of night, they snuck into the United States vehicle yard, started up the engine of a massive M4 Sherman tank, and simply drove the armored vehicle right into Brazilian territory, hiding it under camouflage netting. The disappearance of an entire tank caused a bureaucratic panic within the US Fifth Army until they finally figured out who they shouldn't be messing with. But behind the mischief, there was a deep respect being forged in blood. When the orders to attack came, the Brazilians proved their worth. At Monte Castello, under the fire of German machine guns and a merciless altitude, the Brazilians failed 4 times. They were ridiculed by some American officers. But on the 5th attempt, they refused to retreat. They charged up the mountain through a blizzard and seized a position that the Americans themselves couldn't break. There, American arrogance turned into admiration. The United States generals realized that those mixed-race men, whom they had looked upon with suspicion, were some of the bravest soldiers who had ever fought by their side. The war in Italy ended in May 1945. The Feb accepted the surrender of entire German divisions, something that shocked the Allied command. American and Brazilian soldiers celebrated together in the streets of Turin and Milan. White and black men from both nations embraced each other in victory. The barrier of segregation had been, at least temporarily, shattered by the reality of mutual survival. But what happened when the smoke cleared? Why did this powerful story of brotherhood and social defiance remain locked away in drawers for so many decades? By the way, if you love discovering hidden history chapters like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss our weekly videos. The answer to that question lies in the politics back home. In Brazil, the dictator Getulio Vargas looked at those 25,000 returning heroes with absolute panic. How could he maintain a dictatorship in Brazil when his own soldiers had just laid down their lives to destroy dictatorships in Europe? The Brazilian government's response was cruel. The February was disbanded while still in Europe. The soldiers returned to Brazil almost as ordinary civilians. They were banned from wearing their uniforms in public. Their pensions were stonewalled. The story of their integrated camaraderie and bravery was intentionally suppressed by the state, so they wouldn't become political leaders. And in the United States, the American military remained segregated for a few more years, until President Harry Truman signed an executive order in 1948 integrating the armed forces. The reports on how the Brazilians managed a mixture of races without losing military efficiency were archived, forgotten deep within the Pentagon, because they challenged the narrative of racial supremacy of that era. Today, when we look at World War II monuments, we rarely see the green and yellow colors alongside the American flag. But in the mountains of Italy, the earth still remembers. It remembers an army coming from the Southern Hemisphere that taught the most powerful generals in the world a lesson that wasn't in any strategy manual. That on the battlefield, in the face of death and in the pursuit of freedom, every man's blood is exactly the same color. They were the Pracinhas of Brazil, the allies that official history tried to erase, but the truth insists on remembering. If you think this story from our past deserves to be better known worldwide, please click the like button right below, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future episodes, and turn on the notification bell. Also, leave a comment letting us know what you thought of this invisible clash in Italy. Share this content with that friend of yours who loves history, and we'll see you in the next video.